Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Fiveable APUSH review on the civil rights movement and MLK. My name is Liam Macklin, coming to you live from New York City. And if you want to follow Fiveable, check Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, see some replays on YouTube. You can also now download some of these streams afterwards, check out the slides, review, and so forth. A lot of good stuff coming up, Fiveable. So let's go into tonight's stream. Tonight we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. So I'm going to give you a little bit background, talking about what happened, what's the situation of African Americans during Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, 1877 to 1954. Then we're going to talk about a big turning point, which is Brown versus the Board of Education. And then we'll talk about the center of the stream tonight, was going to be about the civil rights movement. And we're going to talk about the rise of Black Power. So some people are saying these are two separate things. Black Power movement is not really a part of the civil rights movement. If you talk about it in an essay, you might get complexity going over there. Is the Black Power movement, Malcolm X, Black Panthers, are they a part of the civil rights movement, or are they a separate thing? Do you put them together? So if you kind of go back and forth with that, if you're writing an essay, you might get complexity point. Yes, it is. So again, we can already start a chat conversation on that topic. Is the Black Power movement a part of the civil rights movement? Is Malcolm X a civil rights leader or not? You know, there's a lot to talk about that situation. So use an option in the bottom. We got ask a question. If you want any question to add during the stream, I'll try to go over the questions. You can chat between yourself during the stream, make some points, and I'll try to follow that. Okay, so let's get into it. So let's talk about background, 1877 to 1954. Anyone knows why 1877 is the year I'm starting? What happened in 1877? Yep, Reconstruction ended. So very good. Reconstruction ended. If you already studied that, if you finished Reconstruction, hopefully, you probably remember that the general years of Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877. The North occupied the South for around 12 years. And during those years, African Americans got the right to vote. Slavery was abolished. They became citizens. So many positive things happened to African Americans during Reconstruction. But as you probably learned, the Compromise of 1877, the North pulls out of the South. And the South basically goes back to not full-blown slavery, but they go to a system known as sharecropping, which is the African Americans have to go back to work in the fields for their former masters. They're not enslaved, but they basically have to, almost enslaved, they have to constantly, they're in a cycle where they're constantly owe money to the landowner, and they constantly basically have to work the land. So it's a horrible deal for themselves. They also pass many what is known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, if you study them, anyone knows what Jim Crow laws are? Yes, basically laws that segregate between the whites and the blacks. So they want to make it very clear in the South that African Americans are not equal. So many Southern states pass all these laws, which are a lot of them are illegal, which are known as in general term as Jim Crow laws, and they basically take away all the rights that African Americans got before the war. Like they can't vote. So anytime they come to vote, they might face things like poll taxes. They have to pay a tax, or literacy test. If they come to vote, they're saying, oh, you can't read this segment over here. Sorry, you can't vote. Or grandfather clause. If your grandfather didn't vote, you can't vote. And of course, there's not going to be any African Americans who was a slave that their grandfather voted. So basically, this is what African Americans have to deal with in the period leading to 1954, basically sharecropping. Lynching is also a very popular event that has happened in the South, and the blacks are no longer slaves, but whatever they gained, the rights that they gained during Reconstructions are all gone. Now, an important turning point we're covering is the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Did you guys study Plessy versus Ferguson? Thumbs up. Yep. All right, great. So Plessy versus Ferguson, a very important case in the Supreme Court. The case is actually Homer Plessy. If you actually saw a picture of him, I should actually posted a picture of him. He looks completely white. He basically went on a train and bought like a first class ticket and got caught and basically removed from the first class because he is like 15% black. He got removed from that seat. So the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, and if you don't remember the whole case, just remember this sentence: separate but equal. It basically said there's nothing wrong with African Americans being segregated from whites, so long as you give them the same facilities. So now Jim Crow law became legal all across the United States. Plessy versus Ferguson is a very important case that it made segregation legal. So now you can separate blacks and whites in schools, in churches, and whatever the situation is. The Supreme Court made this ruling legal. And this discrimination basically lasted up to the 1960s. So you can see this cartoon over here, the Supreme Court famous case of Plessy, up till 1954. So 1954 is a very crucial year that kind of changes everything. So every history teacher might tell you a different turning point. Some people might point on Harry S. Truman desegregating the armed forces. Some people might tell you the Emmett Till story. So everyone has got their own version of history. For me, at least, the way I teach it, I see Brown versus the Board of Education as the turning point in the story of African Americans and in the story of the civil rights movement. So it's a very famous case that went to the Supreme Court. And by the way, it's called Brown versus the Board of Ed because that's the first name on a whole list of kids that they took to this case. Linda Brown, she actually just died, I think like last year or something like that. She was a first grader, and she had to basically attend a school that was like an hour and a half away from where she lived. So she was put on a class lawsuit by the NAACP. Anyone knows the NAACP, what it stands for? You just can just write NAACP in the test, but anyone knows what the NAACP stands for? National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. Very good. Close enough. So the NAACP was an organization that was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, in case you didn't study about W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard. So the NAACP was a legal organization trying to fight to get the rights of African-Americans. So they took many cases to the Supreme Court trying to prove that separate but equal is actually not working, that African Americans have a horrible library compared to the white library, that their schools are not the same, churches and so forth. So the famous case in 1954, led by Thurgood Marshall, here's a picture of him over here. He was the lawyers for the case. They argued in front of the Supreme Court that in case of education, that the case of segregation, separate but equal, does not apply. And the Supreme Court actually agreed with them. And it was a very shocking decision because some people thought that the Supreme Court was led by a conservative, Errol Warren, but he actually decided that in the case of education, separate but equal was unconstitutional. So now they basically are saying, not in all fields, but at least in education, that segregation is illegal and that they ruled that they need to desegregate school with all deliberate speed. So basically overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. So big picture, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Now in 1954, they kind of overturned the decision, and they didn't give a timeline exactly how to desegregate school, but they basically said that you should do it. So that's a picture over here of Linda Brown in the famous case, and Thurgood Marshall up here. You also might want to remember Thurgood Marshall. He's the first African-American to be a justice in the Supreme Court, an associate justice. First time in American history, an African-American in the Supreme Court. So that's another major achievement for Thurgood Marshall Brown and the Supreme Court. Now, how is the South going to respond to the fact that African-Americans are going to go with their schools? So the harshest response actually happened in the South. Some southern states shut down their schools. And one most famous case is, of course, the Little Rock, Arkansas case, where 9 African-American students registered to attend a white school. And the governor of Arkansas basically sent in the National Guard to block the entry of African-Americans. And a lot of this stuff is played on TV, you know. And President Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the commander of American forces in World War II, if you studied that yet, he was not pushing too many civil rights, but the fact that that they sent the National Guard to block the schools, he was kind of pushed to basically send federal troops, and basically African Americans had to be escorted into school. You see this picture over here. It's a very, very horrible picture. If you can kind of get the POV in this picture, like this student here, so he's only like 15 years old, and look at this woman over here. So it's like angry face. Look at this one screaming over here. So it's like history will record you if you're going to be like on the wrong side of history. So remember that, kids. So basically Eisenhower sent the National Guard, federal troops to escort students into school. And if we're moving like 10 years later, there are barely 2% of African American students in schools. So it's not that Brown, like the next day, basically made schools completely equal, but it was the turning point. And that's basically where the whole civil rights movement is born, because now they have an opportunity. Basically, the Supreme Court gave them a case to say that, segregation is actually not legal. So that's where a lot of the power of the civil rights movement is coming about. All right, let's get into, do we have any questions? Yes, ask a question. Let's see what we got. Could a charter and private schools remain segregated? Okay, so that's a good question. Interestingly enough, a lot of people are trying to find a loophole in the whole situation. So they didn't have too many charter schools, I think, back then, but there was a definitely increase in private schools. So a lot of people are trying to find a loophole in the system and started religious schools. All of a sudden, we can have an increase in that. So basically saying, I'm not racist, I'm not segregating anyone, but I'm choosing to put my kid in a private school or in a religious school. So that way they basically can't get you for saying, oh, you're a racist or you're blocking that. So to answer that, increase in private schools, in charter schools, public school does not have the luxury of blocking anyone. A private school can be more in charge of who gets admitted. Okay. So if you have any other questions, just keep them coming, and we're just going to go through the stream. All right, let's continue. Good question. All right, let's talk about Rosa Parks. Anyone knows who Rosa Parks is? Me, you. Okay, so Rosa Parks actually was also involved in the NAACP. So she's not coming out of nowhere, and she basically is kind of like basically igniting the whole civil rights movement into action. As you, in case you probably studied, by the way, how many of you already are studying the 1960s? That's a little bit advanced. I'm just teaching the 1920s in my class. Anybody studying the 1960s right now? Nope. All right, so this is a little bit more advanced. So you guys probably haven't studied a lot of this stuff. Yes? Okay, one person. So this is a little bit advanced or new information for most of you, but you might have heard about some of these people. So we're just going to go through that. So Rosa Parks basically refused to give her seat in the bus. So the way segregation worked is, blacks had separate African American churches. They had separate parts in the theater. They had separate libraries. So the bus was divided into two parts. The first half was given into white people, and the second half was given into black people. So there was a sign in the middle where you're supposed to know not to cross. Now the rule said if the white section was full, then the whites can move to the black section, and blacks have to get up and give a seat to the white person. Okay? That was kind of like the standard situation. It doesn't matter what the age was or anything like that. So one specific night, Rosa Parks, who was a seamstress, she had a long day at work. She was basically tired, and she refused to give up her seat in the bus to a white passenger. Bus driver came over and basically give up your seat. She said no. They called the authorities, and she was taken to jail. Now, because she was an active member in the NAACP, it kind of like made everyone kind of fed up with this whole segregationist system. So they decided to take action. And this is where Martin Luther King emerges as the leader of the civil rights movements. He was a minister in the local Baptist church, and they basically decided that they're going to organize a bus boycott. They're going to boycott the bus system until it's going to be desegregated. And remember, African Americans, we're talking about like Montgomery, Alabama, they're making a big percentage of the population, and most of them are using the bus. So basically, for almost an entire year, they decided instead of taking buses, they're going to walk to work, or going to do some carpools. And sometimes it was snowing, it wasn't easy, or sometimes, people started, insurance companies started to not give insurance for African Americans. So it was a big challenge thing. But at the end of the day, because money talks, after almost a year of buses losing so much revenue, they had to give up eventually, and the bus boycott was successful, and it proved that desegregation actually works if you do some damage financially. So this is an example of Martin Luther King is emerging as a leader of this boycott and kind of getting a national reputation for himself. And that's something he's going to carry until his assassination in 1968. So basically, 1955, he's like on the map, and everyone is hearing about Martin Luther King. So, and again, in general, you're going to probably study in class a little bit more details about Martin Luther King, but you just need to know that general things, that he was born in 1925 in Atlanta, Georgia. He comes from a religious family. He's a minister. His father is also a minister, and he is very, very influenced by the teaching of Mahatma Gandhi, talking about nonviolence, and he's going to basically energize the civil rights movement on kind of Christian principles of give the other cheek and nonviolence, and basically believing that if whites are going to see the errors of their ways, they're going to change their minds. So his version of thing is kind of like non-confrontational. So one example, if you have an SAQ of example of the civil rights movement tactic, is, for example, a boycott. Another technique is going to be the sit-in. And also, to get an alliance, a lot of the early leaders of the civil rights movement are religious leaders, either Christians or Jewish, or a lot of other religious faith are joining together behind it. They see segregation as something that offends God. And Martin Luther King actually is involved in the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during that time. So that organization is another aspect other than the civil rights movement that is helping to get civil rights. So another technique other than boycott, it's called a sit-in. Anyone knows what a sit-in is? Sit-in? Yes, yes. I love when you guys are saying yes, but if you just tell me one thing, what's the technique involved? Absolutely. Sitting on the counter, going to work but not doing, and walking, sit in the white counter to be served. All right, good. So as you can see in the picture over here, so Africans Americans sometimes, again, so they're not allowed to eat in certain places. Certain places are segregated. So the sit-in movements, which is kind of like the emergence of SNCC, which is the Student of Non-Violent Committee or organization, is kind of like pioneering this technique. They go to lounge counter, they refuse basically food, and sometimes they actually get violent treatment. If you go to the Civil Rights Museum in the South, you might see actually some of these images. They actually sit on the counter and people like pour liquid on their head. They put cigarettes on their heads. It's very, very hard to follow Martin Luther King, like the nonviolence system. And that's where later on the Black Power, Malcolm X, will be more attractive to young African Americans who don't want it to go with the nonviolence. But at least in the beginning, the sit-in movements, they basically sit passively, starting in lunch counters, asking for food. They're being refused. Sometimes they get dragged and go to jail. And again, this is creating a lot of bad publicity for the business. It creates a lot of tension. So sometimes, certain businesses decide, fine, let them eat. So the sitting is kind of like another technique of going into places and just sitting and then demanding your civil rights in a nonviolent fashion. So it can happen in the beginning in the food industry, and then later on it can happen in many other industry where African Americans will come in Also later on with white people sitting together. So it's going to be like create a lot of tension in the cafeteria. So the tactic worked in restaurants, and then later on they used it in hotels, and caused a lot of big uproars, libraries where they were not supposed to go, transportation, and so forth. And again, it creates a lot of financial damage, it creates a lot of tension, and sometimes people are deciding, you know what, it's not worth it. Also, the media is coming and covering this sort of thing. And sometimes also, let's say they arrest so many people, they put them in jail, and then these people in jail refuse to take bail. So the jail is just full. So you don't even have more place to shove people into jail. And the people in the jail are not leaving. So that's another system that's kind of overloading the system. So now we have boycotts. Another technique is we have sittings, and Martin Luther King is preaching the gospel of nonviolence. Okay, so you're going to object, you're going to demonstrate, but you're not going to attack anyone. And that's the message that they're getting. And of course, there's going to be a lot of violence around. So another thing that we have other than boycotts and sittings, we have marches. We have a lot of marches with the South, in the South. So Martin Luther King is going to Birmingham, Alabama, which is considered like one of the most racist and segregated places in the South. And his method is like basically confrontation with people in peaceful manners. But it's a very, very big turning point to the civil rights movement, because many TV reporters are coming over and they're seeing the violence that is emerging from police officers who are using tear gas, who are using dogs. If you can see the image below here, the dog attacking the person. And a lot of people in the North had no idea what's going on. So this is kind of like what's going on in the South, and it's shocking a lot of people. Martin Luther King himself also gets arrested several times, many times throughout his career as a leader. Sometimes, they arrest him for things like, like driving, I don't know, about 15 miles in a 20-mile zone. So it's like the little things. He's well known among police officers. So in 1963, he's going to jail one of many times. An important document you might have used in the exam, that while he's in jail, he's writing letter from Birmingham jail. And in that jail, he basically is telling to those who are telling him, why are you not patient enough? Why can you not wait? He basically is saying, it's very easy for you to say, wait. But if you felt what African Americans have been waiting for, and see that millions of them have lost their rights for close to 400 years, you will not think it's that easy for us to keep us asking us to go and wait. So letter from Birmingham jail is one of those classic famous writings of Martin Luther King, that and his famous I Have a Dream speech. So after the stream, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I recommend for you to go and read this letter. That's the jail cell where he stood, and that's him, a picture of him getting arrested in a nonviolent way as usual. Another event that kind of shows the unproportioned violence and the radicalization of white supremacy growing up in the South is the case of the 4 girls in Birmingham. So we have a lot of violence towards civil rights activists or anyone involved in attacks directly against African American. In the famous case of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, a bomb is placed in the church, and we have like 22 injured people, and 4 girls die in that explosion. That's a picture here in the bottom of this explosion. So it's like the savagery of like blowing up a place of worship and killing little girls. And again, it's kind of like these things are really starting to kind of wake the conscience of America and the shock of something like that. And if you want the highlight, maybe the highest moment of the civil rights movement, it's definitely the march in Washington that everyone probably knows or heard about, when you have 250,000 of African American, the specific name for that bombing. I don't know if there was a specific name. I think it's referred to as usually as the 4 girls, or the 4 girls are, I think, like the Baptist church bombing. But if you mention the 4 girls that got killed in a bombing, that would probably be enough for them to give you credit for that. So back to the March on Washington. So kind of like 250,000 of African Americans and white marching in solidarity to support civil rights legislation. And among the speakers, we have John Lewis over here. Anyone knows who John Lewis is? Nope. Anybody's here from Georgia? Who's from Georgia? Somebody said they're from Georgia. Okay, Georgia people, tell me what he is. Me. Look at all the Georgia people flying over here. So tell me, Georgia people, who is he? Okay, so he is a congressman from the state of Georgia, and he's also, one of the speakers in this event, and also early on is one of the leader of SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so there are several speakers. Most famous of them is Martin Luther King, but John Lewis also spoke on this march. He's also going to be famous later on. We're going to talk about the beating and the famous March on the Bridge. So what are the goals of the marchers? Their goals was to talk about public works program to reduce unemployment, increase minimum wage, laws protecting against employment discriminations. But it's a big march. You have whites and blacks all coming together. And of course, the highlight of the march is Martin Luther King giving his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," which again, I'm not going to read the whole speech, but interestingly enough, the year is 1963. So we're talking about 100 years exactly after what major event in American history? Anyone? 1963, going back 100 years before, what important event happened to African Americans? Emancipation Proclamation. Very good. All right. So interestingly enough, he's giving the speech behind, you have the statue of Abraham Lincoln. So he's saying, Lincoln's famous speech is 7 years ago, our forefather brought upon this continent a new nation. So he's saying 5 years ago. Anyone knows what score is? What score? That's old English. Nobody says score anymore. What score? 20. Smart people here, you guys. We're going to get some 4s and 5. This is good stuff. All right. So, so 5 scores. So basically 100 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow, because stand behind the statue today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And then he basically says the famous line, I just cut parts of the speech. That's not the whole flow of the speech. There's like parts in the middle. The important part, and he says, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Who wrote, we hold these truths? Where's that part from? So we have Emancipation Proclamation, second paragraph. Anyone? We hold these truths to be self-evident. Thomas Jefferson, very good. What document? Declaration of Independence, very good. So you got 2 references. First, he goes up and mentioning Abraham Lincoln, and then he says basically in the second part that I have the dream that we're going to get the true meaning of that all men are created equal. Africans Americans were not a part of, were never given this part of the document. So what about African American? And then another part of this speech, he says, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. So basically, he's very idealistic in a sense that he's looking for not just legal equality, he wants a society that his kids are not going to be judged based upon their color. He wants them to be judged based upon their personality. And that's a very high ideal. So that's, if you write an essay, if you're going for complexity or things like that, some people said, well, maybe we never achieved that sort of thing. I don't know. Do you guys think we achieved that part? What do you think? Is that too idealistic to think? No. Kinda. No. Unfortunately, no. So yes, so that's a very high goal that he set for himself. That's a very high idealistic set that he's talking about. So we might, if you write an essay, we're going to talk about Martin Luther King is going to be successful in achieving legal equality. But in the speech, I Have a Dream, he's talking about an ideal notion of like an equal society where people just judge people based upon who they are and not prejudging them. That's basically the ideal based upon their race. And that could be also a higher ideal if you're judging anyone who's like whatever their background or religion or sort of things like that. But specifically in the case of African Americans, a very high ideal that he's setting up over here. And some people said we never actually achieved that. Some people said, like, I think we achieved it. I don't have, like, there's no more racism. So, you know, some people, by the way, when Barack Obama was sworn into president, a lot of people in the media were just saying, there's no more need for the NAACP. The NAACP still exists to this day. So some people like, well, you have an African-American president, so, you know, I think we got equality. Can we cancel the NAACP? And a lot of people said, no, there's still discrimination. It doesn't mean just because we have a president. But that's a whole other debate, and we'll get to that later on. So also in the big context of things, if you haven't got to the 1960s, 63 also JFK, President John F. Kennedy, gets assassinated, and he gets replaced by a very important character. You might want to write his name down because he's very, very important for the civil rights movement. Grab your pens. And his nickname is LBJ. Anyone ever heard of LBJ? Who knows what LBJ stands for? Oh, yep. Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson. It's all about initial. His wife was Lady Bird Johnson. All of his family had like initials. Should check out his library in Austin, Texas. Anyone from Texas? Who's from Texas? Me. All right. Hello, Texas person. Good job. All right. So Texas person, go visit the LBJ library, and downstairs you're going to get the LBJ treatment when he stands on top of you. So it's very, very funny. Anyway, so Lyndon Baines Johnson is very, very crucial because he's the president that managed to get all the civil rights legislation actually to happen. So in July 2nd, 1864, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically prohibited discrimination based upon race, religion, national order, and gender. Gender is later going to be used as, some people are going to use this law to give equality for women, but at that point, nobody focused on the gender. They thought mainly upon the race. So basically, the law basically gave all citizens the right to enter libraries, parks, restaurants, washrooms, and all these sort of things. So basically, this law ended the legal segregation. So now, technically, African Americans basically have legal equality in the United States, and it kind of gave more government basically power to desegregate, to create equal opportunity employments, or if somebody gets discriminated based upon that, he can get sued. So LBJ came into the White House. He had two goals as president that he talked about. One was giving equality to African Americans. And again, he grew up in the South. He saw racism firsthand. He knew what it was all about. And the other thing he worked upon is poverty. He might have been considered the best president we ever had if it wasn't for the Vietnam War. But that's a different topic. You're going to study that. So you kind of can see here that LBJ and ceremony signing the Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 creates equality for African American, legal, not the ideal that Martin Luther King wanted, but create legal equality for African Americans. Okay, but there's still the problem of voting. So now there's legal equality, but voting is still a very big issue. So you got your rights, you're equal, but you have no representation, and you cannot vote. So a lot of people saying, okay, so if I can't vote, you know, I'm worth nothing. So there's a still big movement, even with the passage of this law, in getting African Americans to register to vote and getting more African American to vote. So a couple of organizations, CORE, which stands for Congress of Racial Equality. Everyone's got those initials. So if you go blind in the test, you can't remember the whole name, just write the initials. You know, it's better than nothing, right? And SNCC that we just said, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So a couple of these organizations led by Bob Moses, you have a picture of him. He always wears overall. I like overalls. Went to the South to basically started what is known as Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer, African Americans and white students together went to the South to register African Americans to vote in the election. Many African Americans were not even aware of their rights or were afraid of that, so trying to get a motivation. It's also the 1960s, kind of big pictures, a lot of activism in colleges getting people involved. Now, the very, very famous case that kind of blows up the whole thing is the disappearance of 3 civil rights workers that kind of disappeared in Mississippi, and nobody knew what happened to them at that moment. So that's another big TV moment, trying to figure out they're 2 whites and 1 African American. Honestly, it created, to be fair, a big buzz on the media because it was 2 whites. If it was 3 African Americans, sad to say, they wouldn't have cared as much. We know today that they were, we know the details of the story later on, that they were caught by KKK members and the local police, and they were killed. But at that moment, nobody knew anything about it, so it created a lot of tension. But other than that famous case that grabbed a lot of attention, anyone who was involved in recruiting African Americans to vote was basically under direct attack if it wasn't like specifically for killed. So we have more than 1,000 arrests. More than like 80 plus beatings. We have shootings. We have bombings. So in one case, even a bus of Freedom Riders actually is set under fire. So it's not going down without a fight. And some African Americans wanted to voice their voice inside the Democratic Party. Some of them said, I'm not even involved inside the political party. There's barely 1% of African Americans inside the political party. So SNCC organized also the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to give voice for African American. It was led by Fannie Lou Hamer, if you want another voice to plug in, but they were only given 2 seats out of 68. So she gave a couple of passionate speeches, kind of put up the whole where's the voice of African Americans in the Democratic Party, which kind of started people thinking about that thing. So that's another person. We're mentioning a lot of people's names. You probably, for the exam, if you know 1 or 2, you'll probably be okay. So here's a couple of images. This is when we mentioned the bus, like in certain cases, being blown up. Here we have an image of SNCC symbol. So you can see a white and a black hand shaking. Here is actually interesting. This is not an abused woman, although it seems like that. I have to put the caption under that. This is nonviolent resistant training. So yes, if you join these kind of organizations such as SNCC and so forth, you had to get some training because you had to know how to take a punch or to get smacked in your face and not react back. Everyone instinct is like somebody punches you, you want to punch back. So it was a tall order basically to be nonviolent. And here we have the image of some mugshots. And remember, there was also white students that got arrested in that and felt that the civil rights of African American something is wrong. So blacks and white both got arrested in those cases. Of course, African Americans in higher number. So this is the famous poster of the missing of the 2 whites and the African American in the middle. The 3 of them disappeared. And again, I'm mentioning race. It shouldn't be the main issue, but the media probably gave it a lot more attention because there are 2 whites that disappeared, and the FBI got involved in that situation. When did they find out they were caught by the KKK? Basically, because it became such a national event, the president had to get involved and had to shove down the FBI to go down to the South and to do an investigation. So once the FBI got into the scene, very quickly, some investigation to turn things around, they found the bodies very quickly. And then it became national news and their funeral. So that was another big event to kind of push into passing the voting right of 65. And if you're interested in that, there's a good movie about it. It's called Mississippi Burning. Maybe you Google it out. If you're home quarantined, nothing else to do, maybe look it up on Netflix or maybe on YouTube or something. I don't know where it's on. Mississippi Burning, I think it was a Gene Hackman. Kind of tells the story of what happened to them. So that's about that. I think at the end, like everyone during that time, nobody got caught. They didn't do any prosecution for anyone. They just found out the bodies. I think just only a few years ago, finally, like one person who's super old from the KKK was just finally tried and went to jail. So it's kind of like very little, very late. just to continue also, so other than the freedom riders, we also have the Selma campaign. So we constantly have these campaigns of marches in the South. SNCC is organizing a campaign in 1965 to motivate more people to vote. And like during those campaigns, like around 2,000 African Americans are getting arrested. But one highlight event that actually puts John Lewis, the guy I spoke before, over here, you can see him actually standing and waiting. So an event known as Bloody Sunday, if you remember that example specifically, on March 7, 1965. And we actually celebrated that event on March 7 just a few weeks ago. I think we had all the Democratic candidates. They all went to that historical location. But the historical event, Bloody Sunday, marchers came to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and again, they were being peaceful, and the police just came directly at them. You see from this, they came straight at them with billy clubs and tear gas, and sent dogs on them. And this is like national TV. Everyone was just so shocked by the violence of these police officers marching directly and just crashing all these people who are trying to save their life. You know, John Lewis got like his whole head scar with like blood coming all around the place. So that's another event. And President Johnson like had to went TV and just denounced the insane brutality. And this was like kind of the last straw that would lead to the voting rights of 1965. So finally, you can also see Time magazine talking about it. So that summer, LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that act basically eliminated the literacy test and kind of all the loopholes that people in many states found out that you cannot allow African Americans to vote. Also, the passage of the 24th Amendment, specifically eliminating poll taxes, which was another loophole to block African Americans. And interestingly enough, also in big context, most people kind of like, if you want a turning point with the Democratic Party, this is also it if you go to political events, because historically the Democrats was kind of like the racist party of the South. Most people don't know it. They were the party of the South. They got their base, and Republican was the party of the North. And now Johnson, the person who's a Democrat, supposed to representing the South, representing their like segregation agenda, is actually the person that gave full equality to African Americans with the passage of these two important laws. And he knew that this is going to really mess up the Democratic Party in the South. And he told an aide, we have lost the South for a generation. He basically anticipated that he did a lot of damage for his own party, but he knew it was the right thing to do. So LBJ, you got to give him credit where credit is due. All right, so that's pretty much moving about to the civil rights movement. They set up an agenda. And legally, they achieved their goals. They got the right to vote by legal, and they ended up segregation. So you can say that the civil rights movement, if you're writing an essay, you might say that they were successful in achieving their goals, that they achieved the high goals of Martin Luther King of equality. That's something that we can debate, or you can write an essay with pro and con. But there's some groups of African Americans who are not happy. Sorry, question. Could you explain? Can't say it, sorry. Can you explain the Great Society and how it impacted minorities a bit? Okay, so that's a whole different stream to talk about the Great Society. I don't have time to go. We're focusing on the civil rights movement specifically tonight, but I think they're going to have some streams about the 60s, I think, coming up, and I think they're going to go into details about that. But it's just big picture. The Great Society was trying to create an equal society, kind of to break the cycle of poverty. So other than giving equality, Lyndon Baines Johnson claiming America is the richest country in the world, we cannot allow to have poverty. We have to eliminate poverty completely in the United States. That was the ideal. We still have poverty in the United States, but they created a lot of programs. I can't go through all of them, things like food stamps and so forth. But let's go and focus, because we have a little bit of time left, to talk about the rise of the Black Power movement. So not everyone in the African American community was down with Martin Luther King of give the other cheek and like don't be nonviolent. A lot of people were like super angry with the violence, and they were not just willing to be crushed down. So there's a kind of change even inside the marches of the civil rights movement. People like here, like Stokely Carmichael, who actually marched for Martin Luther King. And one of the marches, he basically started to preach the slogan of the new movement. Basically, he talked about Black Power, which is kind of the cry of the militant African American. And they kind of grew frustrated with this whole slow pace of reform, and kind of believe that they will never get equality. And if it's legal equality, it means nothing. Or some of them also talked about there's still poverty or there's still economic disadvantages. So, who cares if I'm still poor, that they passed some law. So for them to see the whole marches is like kind of a big sham. And some of them also started talking about why we're cooperating with white people. Like, what's the point of that? Maybe we should just work for ourselves. So if you want a foundation of African Americans where the whole thing starts, the beginning point, it might be Marcus Garvey. If you actually studied Marcus Garvey, anyone studied Marcus Garvey? No. That's bad. Go to class and ask your teacher, why didn't you learn about Marcus Garvey? Tell him the guy from Five was very, very disappointed. All right, so Marcus Garvey is kind of the beginning of Pan-Africanism, or going back to African, and the first person actually to talk about Pan-Africanism, that Africans should have pride in their race. But for the 1960 context, the leader of that time that basically puts this whole ideals on the map is Malcolm X. Anyone knows who Malcolm X is? I'm sure you know Malcolm X, right? Yeah. He has a movie on them. There's no movie on Marcus Garvey. When you get a movie on Marcus Garvey, I'm sure you guys know anything about him. So anyway, Malcolm X was actually somebody who was kind of like a criminal, like a drug addict, a petty thief, something like that. Got caught for like a burglary or something like that, and ended up in jail. His real name was Malcolm Little. He was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska. And while he was in jail, he basically started to hear about the Nation of Islam, which is kind of like this African-American religious organization, which was kind of like a black supremacy organization. So if you have a white supremacy organization like KKK, you have a black African-American black supremacy organization that kind of talked about that maybe you should separate the blacks and the whites, and maybe blacks are actually superior than white people. So Malcolm X, while he was in jail, converted to Islam and joined the Nation of Islam when he left jail, and became one of its most famous speakers. Other people were members of Nation of Islam. People like Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer, was also a member of the Nation of Islam. So this is an event that you see of the Nation of Islam. This is their leader, Elijah Muhammad. They call him the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And Malcolm X became one of the best speaker of the African Americans movement. And in many speeches, he criticized Martin Luther King and called him an Uncle Tom. Anyone know Uncle Tom? The term, where is it from? Okay, so it comes from the term Uncle Tom's Cabin, if you studied that book in the context of the civil rights movement. And Uncle Tom is kind of like a derogatory term for one black person to another. It's basically saying you're trying to be white. You're kind of like, sucking up to the white person. So he called Martin Luther King like an Uncle Tom. He called him a lot of other nasty words that I can't say. But anyway, he basically went against the whole ideology of being nonviolence. He said, if somebody comes to attack me, I'm going to have a weapon to protect myself. I'm not going to give the other cheek. African Americans have been doing it for too long. And if you want to get your rights, you have to use, power to put it back. One of his most famous speeches is called The Ballot or the Bullet. Summarized the whole speech. If election don't work, guns do. So you can try, the election system. If it doesn't work, use the bullet. Okay, so he was very, very radical in his attacks. But then basically in the last year of his life, he kind of changed all of his viewpoint. He went to Mecca because he was a Muslim and saw blacks and white, practicing religion together. And he kind of changed all of his viewpoint of whites. He saw the equality, and then he decided basically to leave the Nation of Islam and move away, denouncing violence. This is the first and only meeting he had with Martin Luther King. I think they met for only 15 minutes, and he basically apologized for all the mean things that he said, and he said he's even willing to work with whites And he also criticized Elijah Muhammad and many people in the Nation of Islam. And because he denounced them, eventually that led to his assassination in 1965 by what we know today, former members of Nation of Islam. There's also a great documentary on Netflix now, Who Killed Malcolm X, if you got free time. It's like 5-part, very, very interesting, goes into the details about the wrong people that got arrested and who are the real people. It's a lot of interesting, anyone who likes conspiracy theory, get into that. Or also, if you're interested, there's the autobiography of Malcolm X that tells all of his story and all the people that, all of his life, like growing up in gangs and violence, how he converted to Islam, and basically a 360 thing. It's a very fascinating autobiography. That's another thing, if you can use outside evidence in an exam, I think it will be very impressive if you can mention that book or mention that. So Malcolm X is the beginning of kind of like the slogan or the inspiration for the Black Power movement. When I say the Black Power movement, I'm just not just saying we want to be more aggressive than Martin Luther King. We're going to talk about Black Power, so you can see the fist up is a symbol of that. James Brown, singing "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." Don't ask me to sing that, but you can look it up. "Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud." I'm not Black, but he's Black and he's proud. And also we can see like this famous event, like in the Olympics in 1968, we have 2 African-American who won the first and third place, like lifting a fist for African-Americans. That created a lot of attention in the media. We can also see a change in the hairstyle. So instead of like straightening the hair, that's one of the passages in the Malcolm X biography that he talks about how he always straightened his hair, trying to look white. And once he came into like being proud more of himself, he let his hair go natural back again, something like that. So the Black Power POV, if you want, point of view on things, is a lot of times is that whites should not dictate the civil rights movement, because Martin Luther King cooperated with a lot of whites, and they believe that African Americans should just struggle for themselves separately, that they don't need to operate with the whites. And another thing that they talked about is electing more African Americans into variety of positions, local mayors, Congress people, and so forth. And they believe that also they preach the gospel of more revolutionary struggle for self-determination of African Americans. Also, legacy, that if you were going for legacy from what we have from African American Black Power movement to this day, there's a terminology change. Still from those days, they still use the name Negro. They switch from that, starting to use the name Afro-American, and that's how we get the term today, African American. So they start to apply that around the 1960s, 1970. Another person is Moulin. Nobody probably heard him here. If you write this in the exam, you're going to blow the exam reader's mind. Maulana Karanga founded the organization called US US organization, and he is the guy that created the holiday of Kwanzaa. Nobody ever remembered this guy, but everyone knows Kwanzaa. So a couple of organizations that were created during that time, and now you know what Kwanzaa is. He was actually a college professor. It's a very interesting character. I put this book over here, Us, if you want to look it up on Amazon later. It's a very interesting book that tells us all the weird stuff that happened in that organization. But Us, like the Black Panthers and many other organizations, more Pan-African organization, talking about Black nationalism, talked about Afrocentricity renewal. So maybe we need to start picking more African-American names. Most African-Americans historically had slave names, like O'Neill or Johnson. They were like, I'm not a Johnson, I'm not O'Neill, that's my slave name. So most of them started to embrace more African names, like, Malcolm Little changed to Malcolm X and then became Malcolm Shabazz. So more either African names or more Islamic names. And the holiday of Kwanzaa, which very, very few people get what it is about. It's kind of like a mishmash between like Christmas and Hanukkah. Don't say I said that, they're going to get upset, but it's kind of like a combination of those things. But it talks about African unity and celebration of African American heritage and so forth of that. So he created that holiday, which is celebrated by African Americans today. And finally, one or more two groups, probably one of the most famous Black Power is the Black Panther organization? Anyone heard of the Black Panthers? But I need to reference a film here too. How many more films reference I have to do in one stream? Yes, yes, great. So Black Panther Party, full name for self-defense, that's an image or a logo here, was led by Huey P. Newton. You can see him over here. And again, imagery, very important. You can kind of see him sitting here like an African leader. And Bobby Seale founded this organization in Oakland, California, and they started up talking, being inspired by Malcolm X, they started talking about that African Americans should have self-defense, that they need to protect themselves. So they started to carry weapons, and walking down the street, and that created a lot of interest with other African Americans, and created a lot of tension with police officers. So they demanded the release of African Americans from jail. They had a lot of physical interaction with the police, getting arrested, violence, and many other things that happened to them. Some of the positive things that they actually created, which has some legacy, is they created free breakfast programs for children, and they provided health clinic tests for sick kids. So they provided some community support, and that was something very, very positive about them. On the negative side, there was a lot of drugs and violence involved in the organization, and eventually 1960s has seen a really, really sharp increase. They basically opened branches all across the United States. In the 1960s, their leader, Huey P. Newton, goes to jail several times, one for killing a person, gets acquitted. That's a whole other story. But eventually, with the FBI on their case and a lot of shootouts, the organization is going to decline in the 1970s. And finally, a sad end to the end of the civil rights movement, if you want to finish a date, usually is April 3rd, 1968, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Gets shot in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there to support city striking garbage workers. And the night before, he gave his famous speech. He's got a lot of famous speeches. It's hard to remember all of them. Talking about the promised land, kind of giving himself a metaphor like being Moses, basically saying, like Moses went to the mountain, basically saying, I want to get to the promised land, but God allowed me to go to the mountaintop, and I've seen the promised land. My eyes have seen the coming of the Lord. So basically saying, predicting, he knows that something bad will happen to him, saying, I won't see equality for today, but I've been to the mountaintop and I saw it. And the next day he gets assassinated by James Earl Ray in the hotel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. That hotel, by the way, today is a civil rights museum, and you can go and visit if you go to Memphis, Tennessee. And they actually kept the room where Martin Luther King visited, and basically the same bed, the same thing. They didn't touch that, but the whole rest of the hotel turned into a museum for civil rights movement. And his assassination basically exploded the next day to riots all across the United States. That's something he was probably not interested in happening, but it's kind of like the end of the killing of the dreamer was kind of like a sad end to the civil rights movement at that point. So just to finish it up before we get to if any questions, think Fibeable. Check out Fibeable Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. You can check my book also here, Qigong for Beginners. I also teach Tai Chi, Kung Fu, and Qigong. So here's a little plug-in, shameless plug-in. Everyone needs to plug in something, right? I wrote a few books. You can check it up on Amazon. Everyone is staying home. So good to read books, people, not to just be on the computer all day long. Cool. Q&A. Let's get into question now in case I missed something. You guys are going so fast in the Q&A. All right, let's get into question. If Rosa Parks didn't refuse to give up her seats, or if MLK didn't get involved, would it still have been as popular as it is today? I mean, there were many events before Rosa Parks. Many people got kicked out of the bus before. It was just that moment of explosion. So it's that kind of question, would have history still be? It seems like Martin Luther King was just the right person at the right time. He was very charismatic, and it really, really helped propelled the civil rights movement. So it's kind of one what if. Okay, so we answered that. We answered this. Let's get in. Was there a particular person who founded SNCC? Is that one specific person of SNCC? They had like different leaders every year. SNCC had different leaders every year. I mean, John Lewis was a leader in one event, and Stockley Carmichael was also involved in SNCC. But SNCC is an example of an organization that used to have was nonviolent and had blacks and whites, and later on got more radicalized and less white members in that. Was the movement, were the participant, but any successful participate violence in any or successful? I mean, that's a great question. You might get complexity for that. I mean, violence never really achieves anything. I think most of the organizations that were involved in violence, you can't get a specific agenda across. I mean, Black Panther Party had an event or two of shooting police officers, so more police officers just showed up, and more people eventually ended up in jail. So the whole infighting never was successful. Well, we do know today that the FBI did target the Black Panther Party and wanted to finish them. J. Edgar Hoover saw the Black Panther Party as one of these most dangerous elements, and he definitely thought that there were a lot of communists involved in that. Is this in this movement, did people get arrested for not doing anything? Yes, people get arrested for not doing anything. That's a part of the nonviolence movement. You're just sitting around. You might sit in your college campus and block people from walking in, so you get arrested. You might sit in a restaurant or a bar, or in a hotel. So yes, you get arrested for doing nothing, and that's where people were trained how to get dragged away. And that same technique also were used, for people demonstrating against the civil rights movement. So it's not just, the Vietnam War. It's not. They used the same technique in other groups from the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement kind of start all the other movements in the 1960s when you get to that. Let's see what more we got. Why did the NAACP keep its name if the word colored is considered derogatory nowadays? That's a good question. I don't know. I guess that's a great question. I guess if you have an historical name, maybe it's kind of hard to change it or update it. You already have the initials. So I don't know. You should contact them and tell them, like, you think they change the name. Okay. Will we get less points for saying the abbreviation rather than saying the full name? I mean, it's all about kind of impressing the reader. I don't think they're going to give you necessarily less points if you read NAACP. I think if you know what the NAACP is and explain it, I don't think they're going to take less point. But big picture, the more you know, the more impressive it is. If you can mention a book, if you can make a quotation from the book, it's more impressive. If I say, like, Thomas Paine wrote, whatever, American Crisis, one thing, but if I say this is the times that try men's souls, it's a little bit more impressive because I knew a little quotation, so why not? The more you know, the better it is. Great Society, we already talked about. So yeah, there's going to be a stream about the Great Society. You can follow that. Let's see what else we got. SNCC, we talked about. What is SNCC? Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So they were a part of a branch of the civil rights movement to try to organize sittings and boycotts and many activities to get students in colleges organized to help to facilitate the civil rights movement. Was the Black Panther Party referred to in the movie The Butler? Yeah, I think I saw it when it came out. I think you can Google up. I think that one of the people in it becomes radicalized, and I think he joins the Black Panther Party. You can't sue me for that one, but you have to look it up. I'm sure that's not going to be an exam. Was the movement where participated? Okay, we did that already. It's twice. You mentioned a movie about the Black Panther. You mentioned a movie about the Black Panther movie. What what was it? I think it's called Panther, just the name Panther. But that's one of those movies that it's super hard to get. It's one of those things after like, I don't know, like years ago, I got to Google it someplace and like got somebody download. It's one of those movies that I don't think they like it so much, so they kind of like ban it everywhere. But it has a good background until the end. The end is kind of bogus, but almost up till the end, the movie is pretty much historically correct. At the end, they kind of make this big conspiracy theory. They kind of ruined the movie. So I would watch it maybe 10 minutes to the end. It's all good. Is it related to the to Marvel's Black Panther? I mean, they probably picked the name from that, you know, like, I mean, they like the name. I think the Black Panther Party liked the name, kind of like a panther, like aggressive and also black. So again, talking about power of African Americans. So they really like that image. Sometimes imagery, the Black Panther Party had their own newspaper. They used a lot of strong images. You know, they had like black leather jackets. They had a beret. A lot of people are like, "Ooh, I want to be in the Panthers. That's so cool. That's so like, you know, even white people are like, these guys are cool. I want to join them." Like, you know, so it was a big part of like African Americans. So many Black Panther Party's questions today, people. Very interesting. Was the Black Panther Party former a political party? They were not official a political party, but they kind of changed strategy in the 1970s, and they tried to have members of the party running for political office. So they tried to support the election of members. Even Bobby Seale, one of their leaders, I think, ran for a local election. So they tried to get their people to get elected. So that's kind of a strategy change they had in the 1970s. Okay, so I think, whoa, that was a lot of questions. Okay, so this is like booming. We have so many people coming in today. If I see more question here. Okay, so yeah. So thank you everyone for joining tonight for this live stream about the civil rights movement. You guys have been awesome. You're going to study this stuff. It's coming up in the future. I hope everyone stays healthy. Elbows, don't shake hands, social distancing. So anyway, thank you all for coming tonight. Thumbs up. Hopefully everyone will get fives. It's called Fiveable. Check the streams. And you've been awesome. I shook up the world, everyone. Peace out.